Welcome to class. We shall be talking about arrays. What is an array? An array is a special variable that stores multiple values or elements of the same type. So with the help of an array, we can create a variable and then store different values in that same variable. So for instance, I can have an array with size of 3. My array, I can call it num, and in the num array I might want it to hold these 3 values, 2, 5 and then 8. So this is an array. A variable is created, and because that variable is an array, it allows for multiple values to be stored in it. It can be 3, it can be 4, it can be as many values that you want to store in the variable or in the array. All you need to do is to specify the size when declaring or when creating the array. Now this is different from the variables we've been creating in our previous classes, which are not arrays. Now with a normal variable, it allows us to create or reserve a space in memory which we can store only one value. So for example, I can store 3 in this normal variable, which is not an array. Anytime I want to store a different value in the variable num, it means the new num must override the old value. The new value must override the old value. So in case I want to store 5 in the variable num, which is not an array, it means when I store 5 in memory, it will override the 3. So this is with our normal variables in our previous lectures, or in previous classes. But today we are looking at arrays and what that arrays do. It helps us to store multiple elements or values of the same type. When we say of the same type, it means the elements can all be of a data type int, or all of them can be of a type string, or all of them can be of a type char. So once you have those elements having the same type, we can create an array and store all of them in it. Okay, so we now look at the syntax for declaring or creating an array. The syntax. Okay. Now I will juxtapose the syntax of our normal variable to that of an array for us to see the difference. Okay. Now in the normal variable, it says we should write the data type, which you know already, and then the name of the variable followed by the semicolon, followed by semicolon. But when it comes to array, it says we should write the data type followed by the array name, which is any name of your choice that you want to name your array, followed by the size of the array, the size of the array. So the size will tell the compiler how many elements or values you want to store in your array. And then we have our usual semicolon. So this is the syntax for declaring or creating an array, whereas on the left you have the syntax for declaring a normal variable. Now, so we can have an example for both. So we can say int num in the case of the normal variable, but in the case of the array we will say int num, and I have the size as, let's say, 3, and then my semicolon. So that means I've created an array with name num, and then that array is going to hold 3 elements or 3 values. Okay, now back to the normal variable. After declaring your num, you realize that we can assign a value, let's say 4, to the num. We can assign a value 4 to the num. Now, in the same way, when it comes to an array, after creating the array, we can also assign the elements, or we can also assign the values to the array. So here too, we say num. We don't bring the data type again because that is used when we created the array at the first instance. So now we say we want to assign values or elements, the 3 elements, to the array called num. So this is how we do it in C++. You write the name of the array and then you bring your square bracket. Now, in array we have something we call indexes or positions. Every element or value stored in an array is occupying a certain position, which we call index. When it comes to array, we also have index, and then the index starts from 0. So index 0 means the first element is stored at index 0. The second element or the second value will be stored at index 1. So that is how it works like. So I have num position or index 0, and at that position I want the array to hold the value 2, and then I say num index 1, and I want it to hold the value or the element 5, and then num index 2, I want it to hold the value 10. Okay, now we ended at index 2 because the size is 3 and counting begins from 0. So when you start counting from 0 to 2, now you get 3. Now a pictorial representation of this code is like that. An array of num is created, and in the array we have stored the elements or the values 2, 5, and then 10. 2, 5, and then 10. And then the compiler works with indexes when it comes to arrays. So what is the index or the position of the element 2? It is occupying the 0th position. That is index 0. 5 or the element 5 is occupying index 1, and then 10 is occupying index 2. So that is how array works. The counting begins from 0 in that order. Okay, so this is just an example of an array with size 3 created, and then the individual values or the individual elements are now assigned to the array norm with the help of the indexes. Okay, now realize that with this approach we declare the array first, and then we now assign the individual element or values to the array. Now assuming you have about 20 elements to be assigned to an array, will you or do you think it is prudent to create the array first and then assign all the 20 elements one by one? Now when you do that, you are not wrong, but it is a precious time you are wasting. So you will look at another approach to go about this, and that is with the help of the initializer list. You realize that as in the case of a normal variable, let's have the two again side by side, and then array here. You realize that as in the case of the normal variable, you can decide to straight away initialize your array. That is at the time of creating it. So we will have an example to like int num is equal to 4. Now realize that this one, which you know already, we didn't create the array and then we now came and assigned using two statements or two instructions. We are just using one instruction by initializing the variable num at the time of creating it. In the same vein, we can also look at the array like that. We can choose not to create the array first and then assign all the elements one by one, but we can do our initialization just in one instruction or in one statement, and that helps us and what helps us to do that, we have what we call the initializer list. That helps us to assign all the elements to our array just at the time of creating it. So let's look at an example of that. So still using the num, I can say int num, and then still the size of the num is 3. Then I bring my equal to sign, and then I bring my bracket or my braces, and then inside the bracket will hold all the elements or the values separated with commas, and then I have my semicolon. So let's use the old values we used: 2, 5, and then 10, semicolon. So you realize that this is quite simpler and short with just using one statement. So an array with name num is created, the size which determines the number of elements to be stored in num is also here, which is 3, and then those elements or individual values are now stored using the initializer list. So that is the initializer list, and then all the values or the elements are separated with commas, and then we have our semicolon. So for instance, if you have something like this and you want to multiply 5 and then 10, you want to multiply the elements 5 and 10. Now don't forget, I've already said array works with what we call indexes. Array works with indexes. Okay, so to multiply 5 and 10, we can just say this is not the full code, it's just the code to multiply. So we can say cout. Now 2 is occupying position or index 0, 5 is occupying position or index 1, and then 10 is occupying position or index 2. So this is how you write. It says cout num index what? Where is 5 occupying? 5 is occupying index 1 times, and then num index 2, and then we have our end line. So now the compiler will reference the index and then fish out for the value that is occupying there, which is 5, and then multiply it with what is occupying position 2, which is 10. So 5 times 10, when we build and run our program, we should get our result as 50. So this is basically arrays. Now there is some difference I want you to know with the use of the square bracket. When you are now creating the array, this is the size or the dimension. So when you are first creating the array, or the first instance of using the square bracket, you use it to determine the size or the dimension of the array. That is, how many elements do you want the array to hold. Now after doing that, anytime you use a square bracket, you are now referring to the index or the position of an element in the array. You are now referring to the index or the position of an element in the array. So you realize that here in the example, the first time of creating it, it determines the size or the dimension of the array. And then when it comes to the code, the next time of seeing this one, we are using it for the position or the index of where an element is occupying. Let's go back to the previous demonstration here. Also, in this code, the first time of using the square bracket, we use it for the size or the dimension of the array, telling the compiler that the variable num is going to hold 3 elements. But the next time or the following times we saw the square brackets, they are used for the index or the position. The index or the position of where individual elements are occupied. So this is by way of introduction when it comes to array. I will quickly demonstrate a code for you. Then you also practice on your own. And I think there will be an assignment for you to do. Okay. So let's just work on the demonstration I did on the whiteboard. So I have my array created. First of all, I will use the first approach as I demonstrated on the whiteboard, where I created the array first and then I assigned the elements one by one. So num is created. Then I come and say num position or index 0. I store the value 2. I semicolon num num at position 1. I store the value 5 and then my semicolon, and then num at position 2. I store the value 10 and then I have my semicolon. So now we want to multiply 5 and 10. Now don't forget C++ or our compiler works with the indexes. So you now have to look out for the indexes of the element you want to multiply. So I can simply say cout num index 1 times num index 2, and then your usual end line counts. So if you want to multiply 5 and 10, this is how you go about it. You fish out for the indexes of those elements you want to multiply. You give it to the compiler and then the compiler will compute for you. Okay, so let's see our answer. Okay, so we now get our answer as 50. Okay, so this approach, I declare the array and then I assign the individual elements one by one. And like I told you, if you are assigning 20 elements, you can't say num0 equals this, num1 equals this, num2 equals this, num index 3 equals, you can't do all of that. So we go the way of the initializer list. So I will also demonstrate that. So let me clear this. Okay, so in just one instruction, at the time of creating the array, I have my size, and then I now have our bracket here, or the braces, and then inside the braces uh, you initialize all our values or the elements to the array norm. So the first element is 2, the second element is 5, and the last or the third element is 10. And don't forget, as we looked at in the syntax, after the initializer list you have your semicolon. So now in just one statement we have done what would have taken us several statements to do, as in the case of the previous example. Okay, now it's because of time, that is why I have my size as only 3 and I have only 3 elements or values stored in it. But you can have an array of size 20 or size 100 or whatever, what have you. Okay, so now with this one I also want to multiply the same 5 and 10. So we now say cout norm, where is 5 occupying? 5 is occupying index 1, and then times norm, where is 10 occupying? 10 is occupying index 2. Okay, then our end line. So this should also give us the same answer, which is 50. Okay, good. So we have our answer here. So you realize that going the way of the initializer list is very simple and short. Okay, now if I say values or elements, they mean the same thing, so I can use it interchangeably. Okay, so this is just a simple example of an array. So I can give you a question, and then that in that question an array will be created with values initialized, and then I highlight some of the values and I ask you to perform a particular operation on those values. So all you need to do is that you need to know the positions or the index of those values, and then you are good to go. Thank you.